Welcome everyone. My name is Cristian Vaccari. I'm co-director of the Center for Research in Communication and Culture. This is the first installment of our seminar series, which this semester has gone virtual, as most of these initiatives have all around the world. I just wanted to give the floor for a few seconds to my co-director, Ale Belfiore, for a brief greeting, and then we'll get started with today's speaker.
Thanks, Christian, and welcome everybody. It's a pleasure to be able to finally host this seminar series, and clearly not quite as the same experience as being all in the same room. But just very briefly, I wanted to thank Jessica Robles and Rachel Armitage for all their help in liaising with the speakers and just helping in getting these series going. So it's a bit of an experiment for us. That's the first time we've had a CRCC meeting online. So thanks, Valluvan, for being, our first in what we hope is a series of events. And we're trying to, work with what we've got and hopefully being able to play around with these format and create content for the website alongside having a good conversation today. And I think that's all from me, Christian. So passing back the microphone to you.
Okay, well, welcome everybody. My name is Rachel. I'm a PhD student in the CRCC Centre, and I'll be seminar. So as Ellie and Christian said, we're very lucky today to have Dr. Valluvan joining us from the University of Warwick. This is actually, due to COVID and various calendar clashes, this is, I think, our third reschedule for this talk. So we're really glad to finally have you with us, Vallu. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to Vallu. I guess a couple of quick points before. If everybody could keep their microphone on mute whilst Vallu is speaking, but obviously it makes it a more pleasant experience for everybody if maybe a few of you could keep your camera on, so Vallu feels like he's speaking to an audience and not a screen. So if you're willing to do that, that would be wonderful. In terms of questions, I think we can provide some instructions in the chat, and Christian is noting some things there already, but ideally we would love to have questions in person. So if you maybe hold on to those, pop your hand up using the hand signal, and then we will come to those when Vallu finishes speaking. Of course, if you would prefer to pop something in the chat, we will try to field those as well. So the format is Vallu will speak for maybe half an hour or so, and then we will open the floor and go ahead with some questions. So without further ado, Dr. Valluvan, the Clamour of Nationalism, Race, Nation and Leftist Complicities.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me just fine. If you can't, I can see you best, Rachel, so just start waving your hands demonstratively. That will help. I see actually Richard Bramwell in the audience, so a particular greeting to him, who I know quite well. Let me just start noting that it is actually, I don't know what kind of audience we have today, but for me anyways, it's particularly gratifying to be invited to this forum. Personally, I know that Loughborough has such a distinguished legacy in the theorization of nationalism in particular, a legacy that extends firmly into the present. So in that sense, I feel particularly affirmed in some senses, and certainly particularly thankful to Marco. But equally, I fear that by that very remit, or that distinguished remit, perhaps I will be found wanting somewhat, because I'm going to really try to rush through a really broad terrain, and probably an excessively broad terrain, as you can maybe glimpsed in the abstract. I may be covering a little too much, but I think there's a lot to talk about, so I just want to catch all those angles. But by way of compensation, very happy to field much more located questions in the study of nationalism later in the Q&A, should such questions arise. So this has been billed as the Clamour of Nationalism, so that happens to be my book, a relatively recent book still. And I guess the focal point of that book was how I believe contemporary nationalism had been overdetermined by a range of otherwise very contradictory 20th century ideological rationalities that have been bent towards, all of them have simultaneously been bent towards a nationalist sensibility. But equally, and given my own traditions in a particular kind of race and racism cultural studies, but also post-colonial theory, equally the book tried to survey the centrality of what I believe was a racialized aversion in organizing and animating these assorted ideological articulations as regards a nationalist demagoguery or nationalist politics or resentment. I will therefore talk about this general ideological cacophony today, but I suppose that what I will really focus on is the leftist register. Personally, because a lot of us are perhaps somewhat close to the left. That often tends to be the case in the tradition I borrow from. So I think it is important to subject that register to some particular scrutiny, if you like. But time permitting, I might also attempt towards the end some reflections on how COVID-19 actually, previews particular features, but also paradoxes, I think, regarding what Richard Seymour, who I'm very close to as a thinker, Richard Seymour has usefully coined as being a disaster nationalism. Okay, now, so initially just boring stuff, okay? I'm sorry for that, but just forgive me a history of ideas detour. I think it's necessary, but I admit maybe some of it might be a touch dry. But yeah, nationalism can, of course, be many things at once, and I don't need to tell people at Loughborough that. But nationalism at its core represents, for me, the fairly familiar, well-established premise that, quite simply, the legitimacy of the unitary, territorialized state is derived from its congruence, to use that particular term, is derived from its congruence with the national and ethnic identity of its population. But what's interesting, I think, is that when you historicize its emergence, I firstly think first of the kind of European nation-making projects of the early Romantic era, the early 19th century era, which sealed for me what's that kind of interesting individual community schema central to modernity, right? So remember that ideationally, Romanticism is equally constituted of modernity as the more frequently cited Enlightenment. And often my students are quite surprised when I start speaking on these terms, because a lot of their curriculum is centered on a both sublime but also maybe critical account of the Enlightenment, but completely elides that later Romantic movement. And indeed, for me, Romanticism marks a certain kind of counter-Enlightenment drive, right? Railing against the cold and aloof appeal of so-called reason, and railing against the so-called, the abstract sanctity of the individual. So against this, right, via the idea of nation in the main, Romanticism recuperated this extraordinary emphasis on things like historical spirit, historical destiny, historical continuity, on collective belonging, on cultural essences, and even what Anthony Smith, who I'm otherwise not particularly, I don't find all that agreeable on everything, but what he usefully names as the restaging of the sacred. And someone who I am closer to, like someone like Hannah Arendt, so as was noted by her cuttingly, via surprisingly Edmund Burke, that eminently conservative debunker really of French revolutionary hubris. But as the quote is that the world found nothing sacred in the abstract nakedness of being human. So this is herein for me the historical moment where the so-called freedoms of man being putatively championed by an Enlightenment modernity became in practice really the freedom of the nation and its normative majority. Or to use a different phrasing again of Hannah Arendt, under modernity, a process gradually unfolds where the, quote, nation conquers the state. So seen along these terms, nationalism might be the most enduring, explicitly political feature of modernity. So wherever we look, we see that it is the principle of nation that concretizes the state, and where most claims to political legitimacy lie in an invocation of national identity and national coherence. And crucially, and I say this very much as someone with a background in Sri Lanka who grew up there, and my mother's still there, and I grew up in the crucible of kind of national civil war in Sri Lanka. So, but as crucially as many post-colonial theorists have deconstructed, even the former colonies have been encouraged, invited, or asked to conceive of their own liberation and state formation, right? Firmly in accordance to a violent nation-state premise, with all the forms of nation-making majoritarianism, nation-making enmity, nation-making aversion to particularize minorities and outsiders. This requires. So and I think actually Rakesh might be in the audience. So I think like people like him or others. we are, those of us aware of, say, India, Turkey, Malaysia, Brazil, Sri Lanka, China, etc., will be particularly aware of this haunting trajectory, where the post-colonial investment in the promise of nation-craft has unfolded in line with the politics of ethnic chauvinism, a nigh integralist, I know that's a term used in particular kind of Catholic chauvinism, but nonetheless, a nigh integralist one-nation militancy and various assorted anti-minority and particularly stark frontier battles. Having said all that, however, I think it is safe to say, whatever one's political orientation, that it is race-making that has overdetermined today's nationalist enmity as regards Europe, Western Europe and Central Europe, both mainstream and extreme, both centrist and far right, via, I don't know, assorted constitutive issues like just this kind of overdetermined visibility of the immigration as issue, or Muslims, or just narrations of history, and that has become particularly acute in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement. But also just the alleged kind of corrosiveness of ethnic diversity, allegedly as a social condition in itself. And these are racialized mechanisms that not only inferiorize those who are defined as not belonging, I think that's already well understood, but it also renders this other or others the overdetermined and outsized object, right, of political discourse, distorting in turn the character and content of putatively democratic deliberation writ large. After all, to be at the sharp end of a nationalist politics, and again, I personally have had the really strange fortune, or good fortune, or misfortune of experiencing. Sorry, I think someone's mic might be on. I'm not entirely sure who it is. Doesn't work. I mean, if you don't hear it, it's not a big problem for me. But I say this as someone. I've had the strange misfortune or good fortune of having lived. Okay, thank you. Having experienced this strange thing, like having lived in Sri Lanka as a Tamil, having lived in Stockholm, Sweden, where I grew up as a non-white immigrant, what they call invandrare, and latterly now in Britain, and experiencing that again as an immigrant, but also perhaps an Asian or whatnot. I've had this strange context of being minoritized in this multiple, quite diverse context. But anyhow, to be at the sharp end of a nationalist politics, which I find interesting, is to know yourself not only as an outsider, but to also know yourself as an outsider that is actively and incessantly spoken of. So this entails for me a very different kind of process than just exclusion in itself. But instead, in my opinion, nationalism is better characterized, or at least contemporary nationalisms are better characterized as those moments when political discourse actively centers the specter of non-belonging when making sense of and reckoning with its various economic, cultural, security, social concerns, whether real or imagined. Okay, I happen to think imagined, but that's not for me to necessarily determine. Now my gesturing at the centrality of the nation's constitutive outside, I know that's a very particular theoretical term, but nonetheless, it might seem obvious, maybe even derivative, but it is to be remembered that sympathetic literatures often seem to intimate that nation, and therein nationalism as the appetite for nation and the state forged in its name, is simply a conduit via which to establish community, a structure of belonging that, though itself unique to modernity, is somehow merely an iteration of a broader move central to all history, a move that attests to the comforts of fellow feeling, or the realities, the so-called realities of communal distinctiveness, and even just a certain politics of collective love, as Benedict Anderson intimates occasionally. So herein, even well-meaning and balanced commentators who see nationalism as either a kind of practical reality that can't be undone, or simply the prosaic desire for communally based territorial sovereignty, they still remain, in my opinion, infuriatingly unable to explain why all this kind of purportedly inward yearning, innocently inward yearning for mere belonging, is still so hell-bent on talking about everybody else, finding shrill fault at every turn about the shortcomings, the threats, the encroachments, the incompatibility, the excess influence, etc., etc., of those who at any given point are seen as, iconic embodiments of those who do not belong. Those who do not belong to the normatively construed national subject, or those who do not belong to the majoritarian, purportedly native community. And I think a very useful book on this is Nandita Sharma's recent Native and Migrant, which kind of gives an overarching thesis about this, but across scanning many different global contexts. Now, so that's I'm aware I probably talked a lot, but that's essentially a preview of some kind of theoretical orientation. So with that in mind, what I actually tried to do in the book is not a sustained theoretical account of nationalism, but rather to attempt to explore how different political rationales, ranging really across the left, the liberals, the neoliberal, and the conservative, ranging across that spectrum, all come to problematize the racialized and the exogenous in their uniquely distinctive ways. I'm just do a little potted overview of that, but for instance, I surveyed how liberalism has increasingly, for better or for worse, but has been gutted of any affirmative political project, and even many kind of core liberal scholars are increasingly struck and uneasy about this. But it's kind of gutted of any own affirmation, but it's increasingly only a kind of rather weaponized and opportunistic denigration of primarily Muslims and their supposed cultural incompatibility, via often hollow and grossly disingenuous appeals to a principle of secularism, free speech, gender and sexual equality, the rule of law, whatever, and even just like everyday liberal public civilities, apparently, and a kind of wider ethos of moderation. Similarly, from a converse perspective, right, I discussed at length how conservatism serves as a particularly rich key for something entirely different, a key of national mourning, loss, nostalgia, and unreconciled resignation. Here conservatism, yes, it recalls the lost grandeur of, let's say, empire on the one hand, but I don't think that's sufficient. What it also does exceptionally well is it also recalls the kind of small time, the really small, intimate texture or moral clarity of a pre-war whiteness, or the small time appeal and texture of the rustic, the provincial, the local, the cohesive, the Christian, the Christianist, maybe the monarchic, even the militaristic in some senses, and so forth. And so all of this kind of rich key of mourning, is all of which is still pictured within the comforting wash of a bygone kind of homogeneous whiteness, and/or a bygone time of familial, intimate national integrity. Inversely, the book also gives equal attention to the neoliberal, which I think it's important to disentangle from the conservative, and I steadfastly insist in the book that it's a very different key to the conservative. And one notes here, in my opinion, a much more muscular, rationalistic, confident assertiveness about the future. But this is a shiny confidence where the ills of immigration or the ills of purportedly deficient racial minority communities are still subject to equal reproach. And these are people who are found wanting against this kind of cold logic of a human capital and productivity appraisal, which is how Will Davis discusses it in a very useful and giving manner. Particularly important here, I think, is that kind of fabled point system panacea, which the current conservative class is very keen to talk about, as habitually attributed to Australia. But this kind of point system resolution acts as a particularly, what shall I say, a particularly clinical expression of this logic, where the vast bulk of those who are understood as migrant are seen as low-value people, quote unquote, low-value people who are economically burdensome, idle, parasitic. And low-value people is not hyperbole on my part. This is the very term that Ian Duncan Smith used infamously in the immediate aftermath of the EU referendum on a Newsnight interview when trying to describe the immigrants that were till then coming through the EU. Similarly, the kind of heroic liberation from the bureaucratic regulatory burdens of the EU is presented here as unchaining Britannia. This again being, of course, the title of the book, by the gaggle of militantly neoliberal, but also hard Brexiter MPs, who now actually people the front benches, right? Priti Patel, Kwasi Kwarteng, Dominic Raab, and Liz Truss, of course. So and along this logic, Britain stands to recover something. It stands to recover its buccaneering and deregulated market vitality and vim. Echoes, in my opinion, echoes of the East India Company kind of sounding somewhere as they invoke the kind of free market oiled ecstasy of Liam Fox's Empire 2.0. I know this Empire 2.0 is not something he said, and it was more a mischievous civil servant mischaracterizing Liam Fox's approach, but I think it's a mischievous civil servant that I appreciate, and I think was quite inspired. In sum, these are, in my opinion, the broad but kind of contradictory clusters of ideological formation that I think were worth unpacking, and they essentially conjuncturally overlap, in my opinion, to overdetermine kind of today's nationalist closure and appeal, at least as far as political rationalities go. I know there are many other reasons, ways of explaining nationalism's to contemporary appeal, but from an ideological discursive perspective, I think it's something about these multiple political rationalities converging in these terms, along these terms. But there is, of course, one key omission here, right, in the above, right? And I already alluded to this earlier, but this namely being the leftist, the socialist, the social democrat, the welfarist, however you wish to characterize it. And it is here perhaps that I just will dwell a little longer, only because it is the site at which the logics are most perverse, in my opinion. So in the interest of fairness, I think it actually prudent to disentangle three to four genres, yeah, of left nationalist apologia. So the first of these can be actually just merely characterized as party political expediency, okay, that sees stronger appeals to nationalist issues as simply necessary to strengthen electoral viability. The assumption here, of course, is that the population is innately and permanently anti-immigration. Nothing can be done about this. And therein, this a priori fact needs to be appeased. And merchants of this approach, trained really in a kind of focus group prime style of political wisdom, are not themselves necessarily invested in nationalist politics. I often think they aren't, but they simply spy here an opportunistic, if unfortunate, necessity. However, and it gets a little more sinister, I think, secondly, we have a form of romanticized, maybe even melancholic, symbolic identification with the historic working class, which is therein happy to accept or submit to the mediation of the archetypal working class figure as being exclusively white, as being exclusively nationalist, as being exclusively socialist, socially conservative. And that particular phrase is something the blue labor crowd are very keen on using of late. But also, I think, interestingly, as being exclusively provincial. So you don't get working class in the city. You only get them in the towns and the provinces. And I think the latter is particularly important, as what we actually are seeing today is a winning geographic spatialization, a winning geographic clarity of a rooted patriotism on the one hand, allegedly, versus a aloof and deracinated cosmopolitanism elsewhere. So to use, I know some of you might find it more agreeable than I do, but nonetheless, like to use this kind of, I think it's a really tortured neologism of David Goodhart, and actually amounts to a rather patronizing characterization. But for him, you see the kind of provincial and rustic somewheres on one side, right, living in the kind of, who are apparently really quite condescendingly presented as humble, simple, just yokels really in the provinces, juxtaposed against the kind of feral, ethnically diverse, but simultaneously the very elite metropolitan cities. And regardless of where you stand on this, what I find particularly galling of this wider style of pseudo-left commentary is that it invokes class just as it actually empties it of any materialist socioeconomic meaning. So instead, the spectre of class is solely deployed for cultural and nationalist political effect. I think this also relates to a third genre, which I am quite close to, just because I read a lot of these materials. But I think there's something which we can call a post-Marxist intelligentsia. And this post-Marxist intelligentsia is unwittingly much like the alt-right. So they see immigration and multiculturalism as constitutive of a wider neoliberalism. So we have here a kind of broad array of intellectuals, ranging in my opinion, very practiced, very theoretically literate, theoretically involved arguments of someone like Wolfgang Streeck, but then also to like on the other side of the spectrum, the really kind of, I find the quite charlatan grifter types like Angela Nagel, if you have the misfortune to read her. But for them to be neoliberal and anti-capitalist entails from just straightforwardly a rehabilitation of communitarian principles. For them, Marxism ceases to be interested in kind of global structures of accumulation, global structures of commodification, global structures of labor exploitation. I don't know, whatever. Just more generically, global structures of human disposability. Instead, Marxism is just, they read the task of anti-capitalism as some just simply coterminous with the consolidation of national identity, national borders, and so on. How am I doing on time? Rachel? Well, okay, all right, cool. So I think I'll also do the fourth genre, or what I believe is kind of leftist presentation of left nationalist apologism. And the fourth genre is kind of interesting because it's the one that reads electorate's turn, or some segment of the electorate's turn, to nationalism as actually a deformed projection of anti-capitalist distress, anti-capitalist anxieties. So it is argued here that this is actually a misdirected anti-capitalist cry that needs to be harnessed, navigated, but ultimately, in their defense, redirected somehow. So the fourth of these is perhaps the most redeemable from my perspective, insofar as it is the only one that retains an anti-nationalist or post-nationalist endgame. But all of these genres, all four of what I've talked about, I think are equally relevant in kind of imbuing, in a very dangerous manner, imbuing the nationalist resurgence with an incredibly dignifying and ennobling language, right? Ennobling language of class injury, class victimhood, class rebellion, the downtrodden, the voice of the downtrodden, the left behinds, and various sort of kind of so-called as anti-establishment motifs, right? And I think all of these have become extraordinarily decisive for how a remade political right currently orients its hegemonic position. Of course, here in Britain it's very prominent, or here in England in any case. But I grew up in Sweden. I'm very attentive to Sweden. The Swedish Democrats, essentially the far right party, they deploy this sense of absolute victimhood to extraordinarily winning effect, and a class register of victimhood, disingenuously purposed. So I would just say, I don't know if it needs repeating for, I don't know what kind of audience we have, but much of the above sketch of the kind of the multiple leftist genres, marry quite well, in my opinion, with what the current Starmer-led Labour kind of, some of their machinations. Starmer, whatever his merits or demerits may be, not for me to say, is still, of course, and I think is widely acknowledged, is seemingly desperate to give all appeals to England and patriotism a really envious centrist caress. And needless to say, in my opinion, not only does this all result in a kind of grossly myopic distortion of what a center-left project might be at its best, but there's also a recurring failure to understand, in my opinion. But Nesreen Malik, who's a public writer, has been writing on multiple occasions very generatively about this. But I don't think nationalism can be gamed for other purposes, for anti-capitalist ends. Nationalism, in my opinion, is simply, in the final, it's simply not a means to something else, not least left collectivism. Nationalism is always, in the final instance, about its own nativisms, its own primacy, its own exclusionary racism, its own assertion. So anything else is just a kind of quite promiscuously drawn, convenient accomplice, mobilized to make its appeal all the more likely along the way. And needless to say, it is of course the political right that always retains a more well-trained and much more sincere credibility when offered these terms, and even when it might be possible to occasionally make electoral gains on this front. And as a kind of Scandinavia watcher, I think maybe this is evidence in the Mette Frederiksen-led Social Democrats in Denmark, if anyone here knows about that. But even when you might be making electoral gains, it is also the case that under such terms, the left becomes not a vehicle of social democracy, but is instead summoned into power on the basis that it shall act as a dispenser of something else, of nationalist politics, of action, of nationalist actions, nationalist sentiments, as is being widely evidenced with the positions that Mette Frederiksen routinely draws now. So it seems to me that the left self-defeating, bartering with with it is simply, just misidentify with the leftist alibi that nationalisms all throughout the 20th century have solicited to such great effect. And I feel I find the writing of Bloch here on kind of the emergent forms of fascism fantastically giving about that misplaced affinity. I am acutely aware, however, I'm talking a lot, but I'm also acutely aware that in some ways, much of what I said might be just too predictably critical, too predictably solemn account, which is the kind of stock and trade of academics, but, predictably critical, predictably solemn account of just the sheer kind of sublime reach and ideological seduction of this nationalism at the moment. So I actually just think it might be worthwhile to briefly sketch in what remains some conjunctural contradictions, right? Some conjunctural contradictions that are emerging that might allow, other possibilities to simultaneously surface. For instance, I can't really dwell here, but just very quickly, I actually think the way the right, the current right, the political right commands this nationalist victory over the next decade is far from self-explanatory. For instance, one of the key tensions that many have identified, both left-wing and conservative, is that, that the formal right has capitulated really in full to what Richard Seymour has called disaster nationalism, a form of delirium or hubris in the name of the nation that is actually, and quite dangerously from a right-wing perspective, is increasingly superseding some of its other more pro-market, pro-business commitments. And though I can't maybe expand on this here, I think it is worth mentioning that, yes, of course, it was a neoliberal Thatcherite political class that summoned this latest iteration, this latest rendition of Little England in nationalism. But it is increasingly evident that nationalism is displacing or relegating or complicating the right's other formal hegemonies as tied to market economics or tied to small state utopias, as tied to a kind of general principle of fiscal discipline and austerity. And I think some complications are arising. And as Stuart Hall has taught us, such a conjunctural realignment of populist, at least Stuart Hall has taught me, I can't assume, but, such a conjunctural realignment of populist hegemonies does always allow for new and generative gaps in our ideological environment for emergent and residual oppositions. But actually, regardless of the ruling right's kind of potential problems, what I would actually like to end on is to explore how and where this ostensibly triumphant nationalism will travel is actually, of course, and all of you will know this, is being given some new inflections via the ongoing COVID-19 moment, a moment that all of us are suddenly COVID-19 commentators, and obviously none of us are qualified for that. But I will also attempt just a very brief, speculative take on how COVID-19 opens, but also challenges some nationalist premises. So to start, I think, many have said this, and I think they're partly right. Like a tried and tested populist nationalism does appear in some ways relatively muted, or at least flustered by the wider pandemic's era that COVID-19 previews. Indeed, populist nationalism as an entire form seems uneasy, right? When having to contend with actual crisis, as opposed to ones that are simply simulated via, I don't know, Eurabia, the ridiculous notion of Eurabia, or immigrants raiding the collective treasure, or foreign languages, running roughshod over otherwise dulcet England, or even just, British largesse EU largesse at British expense. But as people like, Paulo Garbardo and others have, we also fear that populist nationalism is only biding its time, only briefly wrong-stepped by the sudden recourse of new political questions, the sudden recourse of something that presents itself as a public health imperative. So first, in the broader sense, I do think actually the pandemic's era does seem conducive for the proverbial de-globalist, disingenuous de-globalist. So it's not an anti-capitalist deglobalization, but deglobalist as a kind of meme. So the proverbial deglobalist to have their alt-right say, to entrench the primacy of the nation state, to engage in protectionist scrambles for finite or select health resources, which some have called now vaccine nationalism. And not least to retrench the validity of the border, right? As regards the latter, just consider quickly how COVID-19, at least totemically, offers nationalists a winning card to just conclusively condemn the peril of human mobility and therein the vitality of the border. Similarly ominous, and I think it is often ignored in critical circles, but slowly we're adjusting. I think it's actually 5 minutes, yes? Great. Yeah, that's fine, actually. I think similarly ominous here is the specter of China that is being foregrounded much more aggressively by nationalist commentators. So for all my sins, I read the Daily Mail regularly. I read Bild regularly, like the Bild being the kind of German equivalent, and they're absolutely frothing. Yesterday, they had an extraordinary editorial on China. And this reckoning with China, given its emergence, no doubt, as an economic, military, and political threat of extraordinary, serious world historical proportions, and of course with its own competing nationalist project to bear. So this was already previewed, right, in the course of the Trumpist tariff and technology wars. But it is COVID that seems, in my opinion, to have finally provided the ideal contingencies that nationalist commentariats here, but in the US, in Germany, as I mentioned, but of course, a place like India, where it's completely kind of frothing or frenzied at the moment, have been. So what these kind of COVID gives them the position, the circumstances to cement this China specter in a way that hitherto they've been fumbling for. Well, maybe I can quickly also say the COVID thing. For me, what was unsettling is to just quickly consider how the early days of COVID allowed for, in my opinion, a revived spirit of public health and welfare, and also kind of a renewed mandate for the caring state, not the security state, not the market state, but the caring state, as epitomized by the NHS. But it is striking how quickly that defense and support for the beleaguered NHS captured in Thursday night clapping. I know people were already cynical about Thursday night clapping, but of course, I think many of us found something useful in its initial iteration as a public sentiment, but how quickly that became reduced to patriotic ritual, how quickly it was smuggled into a wider mythology of a kind of increasingly pervasive World War II Churchillism, Dunkirk, Blitz spirit ethos, and essentially recast really as a patriotic national affair, as my friend Malcolm James put it. So here I think a kind of cheapening stagecraft of a civic patriotism didn't take long to displace what was initially a quite mature, generative, and eminently collective spirit of concern about public funding and governmental responsibility. So if we kind of just quickly recap those 3 points around COVID, I think these overlapping themes of retrenched, bordering, the specter of China, and the wider treatment of pandemic's response as merely just kind of patriotic battles, as a national battle, this previews a shape that the coming nationalisms might assume. I think I only have like 2-3 minutes left, so I'll just quickly say by stating the obvious. I mean, any such nationalist myopia, in my opinion, remains fatally compromised in the face of pandemics. It not only refuses to contend with the global scale of the problem, but it also looks for solutions to solutions to disrupted economic flows, etc., at merely the level of national consolidation. So it's, in other words, simply a political project that can postpone at best crises, even as it allows crises to multiply, really. And as observed, I have some strange reading habits, but I'm very fond of this really kind of dissident Chinese group of Marxists called the Chuang Collective, and they've written very well on the social contagion on the current moment. But they have a lovely quote, right? It goes, the destruction wrought by unending accumulation has extended both upward into the global climatic system and downward into the microbiological substrata of life on Earth, end quote. And now the effects of such planetary mayhem scatter, of course, into multiple thickly knotted vectors that no amount of nationalism can inure itself from. Yet a nationalist rendition of crisis can only ever place the problem elsewhere, refusing to acknowledge the metonymic equivalent of the crisis as it sits within. Put differently, the crisis that borders and fortifications shape to repel is always already inside. And I will just say, I actually think there's something quite productive about this as a result. I think younger generations that are emerging, and I mean by younger generation, I mean essentially under 40, maybe even under 50. Even if you think under 50, however beleaguered, harassed, and confused Corbynism was, if you only took the under 50s, Corbyn would have won in an eminently unlikely victory. Similarly, I'm struck by the extraordinary youthful support a mass youthful support for something like Black Lives Matter. I think there is obviously a generational antagonism that's emerging that is much more hostile to the false solace of nation. And the more that the ruling class or the ruling governance appeals to the solace of nation, the more that it alienates those who see no such solace in it anyhow. And I think the younger generation, and it's not, as I said, not just 18 to 24 or whatever, I think that the nature of the 21st century struggles, i.e. climate change, climate breakdown, i.e. the increasingly twinkle-toed mobility of capitalism or capital, which escapes jurisdiction, which escapes taxation, and of course now with pandemic, I think they understand that the nation has no bearing here, that has no credible intervention or solution available to it. And I'm interested in the kind of anti-racism, the internationalism that seem a lot more intuitive to them, and as is coming through in their popular culture, in their own experience of a lived multiculture. And personally, I think there is a sharpening antagonism of a new process afoot, which at least I find solace in, and which I've written on elsewhere. So I think I'll just end there in case I've talked too much already.
Wonderful, thank you so much, Vallu. A fascinating talk, I think we can all agree, and we have some questions already. So Richard, I see your hand up. If you want to unmute and go ahead, that would be great.
Cool. Thanks, Vallu. That was a fascinating talk. I really appreciate it. And I think actually in the last couple of minutes, you started to touch on issues around my question. I mean, this kind of comes out of like just the thought that in response to the earlier part of your talk, that because of your focus on critical thinkers and formal politics, perhaps what you're getting at there is maybe just a massive disconnect between academia as well as politics and everyday life. So I was just, but then later, because you did kind of turn to you know, hashtag BLM and all that sort of thing, I wondered whether you couldn't have possibly have discussed the work of people like Les Back a little bit more as an alternative current, and you know, his ideas of neighborhood nationalism and you know, very local politics, that in which you can see solidarities being produced at a very, very local level, which, you know, orient people towards an outer national perspective, and towards a bit of a suspicion of the lies that they're being told through a nationalist narrative. And I just thought maybe you could open up about that, and where you see thinkers like Malcolm James and Les Back within that kind of schema that you set out.
Fantastic. I mean, you honestly cued me beautifully here, because I mean, this is half the time I'm writing about those things, and I think that's how, to be honest, I know Richard already, and we kind of have this overlap in our themes there around what is essentially the way I've looked at it, using people like Les Back, but of course, in my opinion, Paul Gilroy is particularly important for me there, is the fact, the lived realities of at least urban multiculture. And urban multiculture is rehearsing the critical intuitions, impulses, and motifs that doesn't unlearn difference, that doesn't renounce identitarian claims to difference, but renounces the solace of community, renounces the solace of kind of essentialized identities, and create a much more kind of convivial and a pluralistic, is putting it too mildly. If we're going to use Gilroy, like something quite planetary or humanistic or cosmopolitan. And these things are not produced from the level of political discourse, but it's produced at the level of, you know, urban habitats, but also, and I'm a cultural studies person half the time, just generally in the dialectics of popular culture. So obviously the dialect of popular culture in one way is just a commercialized stream that is doing capitalist work, but that same popular culture brings with it countercurrents around certain causes, and not least the visibility of Black America, if you like, the visibility of urban music that is not contained to the urban environment and is kind of diffused across whole generations who have been reared on this stuff. And I think it cultivates a generative hostility to the supposed solace and kind of panacea type status of nationalist closure. What I will say, however, is I think Les Back, Malcolm James, Gilroy himself, and myself too, we have been too keen to locate this in big cities. That's why I raised the geography point. I think increasingly the prevailing nationalist classes and the kind of punditry is very happy to concede the cities. They actually think it does better work to kind of declare the cities lost in therein to fortify the appeal and texture of the provinces and the towns. And this is exceptionally dangerous and unfortunately winning. That's why personally I like the work of people like Ben Ragali and so on, who are really trying to take the same themes but land it in much more, can I say, humdrum or mediocre spaces. And I say that not in a pejorative sense, but you know, like Peterborough, like Milton Keynes, like suburban Leicester, even Annemiek Saar and them, they take it to at least suburban London, not iconic inner city London, but suburban London, and are trying to locate the productive value of multicultural and a kind of critical intuitions in places which are otherwise seen as the preserve of this new nationalist mobilization. But I'll just finally say, Richard, that unfortunately I think discourse has effects, right? Representation has effects. And in that way, the way that the provinces and the white working class are rallied or as totems or as bias, this starts to therein constitute how the same people narrate themselves. And for me, that's the really dangerous future that awaits, when it actually does become more of an everyday reality, let alone a kind of a political discourse. A fantastic question. I'm glad you put me in that direction.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and yeah, it's a sobering thought that you ended on, but yeah, thanks very much.
Okay, I see we also have a question from Magnus. If you do want to come on screen, Magnus, great. If not, yeah, there we are. Please go ahead.
Hi, thank you. Thank you very much for your talk. This is not my field. I was very inspired. I'm also Danish, so and I am not here to debunk anything. You are completely right. But you made me think, and I don't know how to formulate this, so I'll just try. You made me think about the left. Well, I still remember when the left, at least the Social Democratic Party, became nationalist in Denmark. It didn't used to. It actually used. We have this famous TV clip where the old prime minister, when he was the Social Democrat prime minister long before end of the 90s, he tells this nationalist party, you will never become clean enough to even be a part of any government. And it's their policies that they have now adopted in the Social Democratic Party. But that was not the question. Okay, my question was, with tribalism and nationalism, I found it very interesting when you talked about the working class, which usually belong to the left, and how you describe the nationalist working class as a white man with low education or whatever it is, as now belonging to the conservative realm. This guy, I don't know, this guy has also become the enemy of the new internationalist tribe, maybe, or whatever we call them. We can call them the woke left, or like the rest of us, or whatever. But we also, that guy has also become alienated from that group. And my question is, so the left in Denmark is now divided into either they are nationalists or they are internationalists, or whatever we call them, but buy into this non-nationalist identity. So first of all, why the return of nationalism now? And is the tribalism of the internationalism a reaction to the nationalism? Did that make sense at all?
No, I like it. There's a lot to unpack there. I just want to clarify. I'm not entirely convinced that the working classes in the majority are voting for Brexit Britain or voting for Boris Johnson. But I mean it as a key trope to their kind of discursive positioning. And actually, I think that it's disingenuous on their part to insist on this trope, because however you look at, of course, there's been a spike in the working class vote for right-wing politics. But still, the bulk, the sizable share of the voter base for Brexit Britain and Boris Johnson Britain still comes from the lower middle class and the affluent shires. So that kind of the working class, there might have been a spike, but they're not doing it heavy. It's not their voice. They're not the vanguard of this premise, but it's usefully cited by, and this is where I believe the left is complicit. It's usefully cited as giving it a kind of anti-establishment, rebellious, downtrodden motif. So I think there's something to unpack between the conceit and the reality. Secondly, I have a paper, if you're interested in sociological review, about working class multiculture. So the thing I'm describing, and I think Richard's talking about, is working class. I'm not particularly concerned with middle class progressivism. I mean, I welcome it, and I'm really happy it exists. But my idea of multicultural, these are working class communities. These come from estates. These are white, black, brown, whatever, But they're all working class. And, again, Richard knows about this literature very well. But like one of the problems in our political language is that black and brown folk are seen as racialized folk, and the white folk are seen as along class terms. And this is a completely dichotomous denigration of any feasible political discussion. And if I'm to stretch this to its most logical conclusion, migrants are working class in the main. So it is fundamentally a given that this is a working class constituency that cannot be abrogated. I will also add, to further complicate the claim that this voting base is working class, they do often come from historically labor voting working class areas, but they are older vote, okay? And the older vote, if you know your sociology and you know your post-war welfare state, it's an older vote that experienced certain forms of embourgeoisement, enjoyed certain forms of property stability, enjoyed certain forms of savings and pension stability. And so it is, though working class in form, they in the traditional categories, middle class in status, middle class in orientation. And I think that can't be neglected or overridden. I know what you're saying, though, and I think it's a really tricky question, and I talk about it all the time with my friends. There is something happening where progressive discourse can be alienating. It is obviously the case. I'll have to think about this more, because it is something a lot of us are trying to take very seriously. I just don't have a 1-minute answer how you get around that. But I fully understand, and I don't actually think it's just white working class folk getting alienated. I know I grew up in a working class area in Stockholm, and it's a mixed area, but loads of them are prone to a kind of reaction against, and a reaction that is presented really by the alt-right, but it's not always about race, so it's about many other things. But they are equally prone to talking about political correctness gone mad, cancel culture, safe spaces gone berserk, da-di-da-da-di-da. And these are my friends back home, and I'm the embodiment of work for them, so I have to do like the whole argument. But I grew up in their same world, so I'm not sympathetic as such, but I'm unsettled, if you like. I'm unsettled. I understand what you're saying. I think maybe it's just the right they are winning this culture war, right? They enjoy it. They know that every time they can profile certain culture wars and caricature the left in certain terms, it does a nice work for their own base. It does some nice alienating work for their own base. And hence why this is all they have. Boris Johnson's funny, right? Boris Johnson, in that school talk, post so-called mutant algorithm, and he's speaking at primary school, and it's meant to be a reasonably sober reflection on the debacle. He starts riffing on Harry Potter and Churchill and Black Lives Matter. Like, this is what they want to talk about. This is their preferred ground,
Fantastic. I see we have 3 more questions, 2 in the chat, and then Marco, I see you have your hand up. So I think that might take us to the end of the session. Just before we get there then, Vallu, if people do have further questions for you after the seminar is over, how would you prefer for people to get in touch?
Just by mail. Will the comments be up? Because I'm really interested in comments.
Oh, yeah. I will. 2 questions that I've spotted. So the first one here is from Sam. She says, fantastic talk. You mentioned the Daily Mail, but could you talk more about how would you put the media into this? Sam, I don't know, maybe you need to expand on that slightly.
No, I entirely agree. I fully see that. Like, I'm doing a talk later on around social media disinformation and so-called conspiracisms. But what's interesting is that none of this makes any sense without understanding the profit incentive of social media platforms. So obviously the establishment media, and particularly the tabloid press, is what rehearsed this. So I think sometimes we overstate this new media. And I think there was a really good long read just after Brexit. There was a tabloids that won it. You know, it was like a throwback legacy battle, and they had been steering their ground for 20, 30 years. However, I do think something has happened where the profit incentive of the social media circulation, which has certain tendencies about sensationalism, it takes us all back to Adorno. You know, the profit incentive of the informational cycle of the 20th is more sensationalism, more alarmism, more reduction, and more scandalizing. And the motives for all of those four is to reach for reactionary politics. And in my opinion, the kind of the reactionary nationalist collective is a ready-made staple for that kind of in what we'll call like the circulations of churn, really, where you just want enhanced circulation and enhanced attention economy, enhanced eyeball economy. And this, if the media is driven entirely by that, or the contemporary media, then you're going to see these tendencies being intensifying. And I think what social media does really well, it gives it an autodidactic quality. So it's like your own peers talking like this. It's the investigator looking at YouTube videos about Malmö being a no-go zone, and then it starts circulating everywhere. It gives it a slightly earthy authenticity, which I think is slightly more effective than the establishment press's role in the 20th century in legitimating these kind of themes.
Okay, thank you. Marco, you've had your hand up for a while there. Please do go ahead.
Yeah, but I don't think it really matters because we are almost at the end. Let me first congratulate Vallu, because every time he's talking, I'm impressed by the eloquence that a migrant, can I say so? A migrant can have. I've been a migrant for 20 years or so in this country, and I have I don't know, 0.00 of your eloquence and richness of vocabulary. Very briefly, I'm not sure it's a question, but I think it's more of an invitation, and obviously you know where I'm coming from. The idea that nations, I'm using more nation than nationalism, and I'm conscious obviously to the differences there are between the two, but I think we should be more wary to understand nations and nationalism only in such exclusive ways, as a way of always outcasting the other. This focus of othering, obviously it is there, but should not be the only one. And I would give credit to another dimension, which I think is important to analyze rather than overcome. And it's the dimension of how much what we call nation still exercise a sense of affect, of sense of togetherness, whatever you want to call it, but also in the mundane habits, the kind of things that you are doing every day, and even now in the video, putting the tobacco to the mouth, such a Swedish habit. I mean, where's it coming from? You know, it comes from, we don't do in Italy, you know, so little things that still matter. And I think as a scholar, we need to be conscious also this dimension. So instead of throwing everything away, say, you know, is irremediably associated with racism, so it's not viable. So I think there is more research that can be done. I'm conscious of the time. I don't think there is any, but it's just for the future discussion. Thank you, Vallu, great talk. And I saw from the chat that people were very happy, so thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. I mean, I don't know, I can address that quickly, or is the timing more rigid than that? I don't know.
We're coming up to 2. I defer that comment to Christian and Ellie. Do we have time for an answer?
I would say so. Please, you know, if Vallu doesn't mind, we'd all love to hear his answer. Thank you.
No, I've spoken to Marco about this before. I think we disagree simply in that I actually think politically it's only nationalism that matters. I'm not convinced nation in its banality, and I know the reverse, speaking to Loughborough, obviously you have the banal flagging, so you have the banal rehearsal of nationalist excess, but the banality of everyday culture I don't think can be named as the nation. Obviously it's kind of lived and rooted in local circumstances, and when it is banal, I don't think it amounts to a political premise. It's just a reference. So you know, we're all looking at Marcus Rashford now. And, you know, in his response to the conservative dereliction, he says, this is the England I know, right? So the whole rush of charity and compassion and empathy and solidarity. This is the England I know. I don't think it's appealing to a kind of a defense of England or kind of a politics of England. It is, but what precedes or supersedes the reference point of England is the political principle. And it's the political principle there is one of solidarity, care, social democracy, redistribution, working class uplift. But nationalism, in my opinion, is different. Nationalism is the political principle. Hence why I talk about all this ideology. The ideologies become nationalist in form, but the ideological leanings are promiscuous. Nationalism just wishes to assert its own chauvinism, its own majoritarianism, its own inward logic of closure, coherence, and historical continuity. I know we're never going to resolve this debate, Marco, but I think that's where I stand on this particular matter.
Thank you, Valluvan. Yeah, thank you.
That's fantastic.
Kind comments, guys. I know Rakesh says something quickly, but I can get back to him by mail, I think.
I was going to say, Rakesh, we have one more question in the chat, but we are officially over 2, and I'm aware people may have other things to get to. But just to say again, Vallu, such an engaging talk, really fascinating, and thank you so much for your time. We're really glad to have nailed this one down and had you speak to us.
Can I just say,
please.
The details of the talk, I will give it to Rachel. Thank you for asking about it. It's on November 12th. It's actually a book launch by a writer called Post-Fact, or Is Post-Truth Real, or something like that. But really interesting book run out of Bristol. So I will give the details in case, because I think it's a good book that a lot of us can read and find something in.
Wonderful, thank you. We'll either send that out by email or maybe we'll add it to the events section on our website so people can access that information. So thank you again, Vallu. This session has been recorded, so our hope is to have that uploaded, and this will be available if you want a rewatch or indeed to recommend to anybody who couldn't make it today.